My name is Edward Mallory. I am 76 years old, and I live alone in a house that once used to be filled with voices, footsteps, and the smell of dinners that lingered late into the evening, when my wife would laugh too loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny, and my daughter would roll her eyes but secretly enjoy being home. These days the house is silent most of the time, so silent that I can hear the faint hum of the refrigerator like a low mechanical sigh that never stops. And at night, the ticking of the clock in the hallway becomes unbearably loud, as if mocking me for counting time so precisely when I have nowhere to be and no one waiting for me. I wake up earlier than I need to, mostly out of habit, though sometimes I wonder if my body simply refuses to sleep any longer than a few hours, because it knows that lying in bed is just another way of waiting. And I have been waiting for years, for phone calls, for visits, for some gesture that reminds me I am still a father and not just a forgotten man at the edge of someone else's family portrait. I used to be a history teacher, and I thought that would mean something, that living a life of books and lessons and years spent explaining to young people why the past mattered would leave me with some respect. But retirement has a cruel way of shrinking a man. Once the classroom was gone, I was no longer Mr. Mallory with a voice that commanded silence. I was just Edward, or Ed, the old widower who sometimes buys day-old bread at the store and counts his change twice. My wife Margaret died 9 years ago, and I still speak her name sometimes in the kitchen when I pour coffee, half expecting her to answer from the other room. But of course the only reply is the groan of the pipes. We were married for 50 years, and in those years I believed that no matter what else failed, my health, my job, even my sense of purpose, there would always be her. When she left, everything in me tilted, as if the ground had shifted slightly, and I could never quite stand straight again. It was my daughter, Claire, who was supposed to keep me upright. At least I thought so, because children are supposed to return the care they once received. I had raised her through long nights of illness, through difficult years of tuition, through heartbreaks with young men who didn't deserve her, and I told myself she would remember all of it when the time came, that she would carry some loyalty in her bones. But the truth is harsher. My daughter has grown into someone I barely recognize, a woman whose life is managed by schedules and appearances, whose smiles are reserved for her husband's colleagues and her children's friends, and who looks at me with a mixture of irritation and obligation rather than love. I see it in her eyes every time I am around, that faint wince when I ask her something twice or move too slowly down the stairs, as though my presence itself is a burden she tolerates, only because to do otherwise would look bad. I live in the same house I bought in 1972, the house where Claire learned to walk, where we planted a tree in the yard to mark her 12th birthday, where Margaret cooked every Thanksgiving dinner with a stubborn pride that made her work until her feet ached. But when I walk through its rooms now, it feels less like a home and more like a museum, where the exhibits are my memories, dusty and fading, and the visitors, if they come at all, pass through quickly without really looking. The living room still has the same armchair where I used to sit with papers to grade, but the fabric has worn thin and the springs groan under my weight, as though it too is tired of carrying me. The dining table is larger than it needs to be for one man, and sometimes, when I sit there alone with a plate of scrambled eggs, I cannot help imagining all the places that once held faces, voices, arguments about politics, or laughter at silly family stories. Now I am the only one left to remember them, and memory is a weak substitute for companionship. I try to keep a routine, because without one the days dissolve into a blur that makes me question whether time is passing at all. I rise, I brew coffee, 2 scoops, never 3, because Margaret used to say my stomach couldn't handle it otherwise, and I toast bread that I eat without butter, because the doctor once warned me about cholesterol. though at this point I suspect I could eat a pound of butter every morning and it would not shorten my life by more than a day. I read the newspaper, though the words slipped past me more easily than they used to. And then I might water the plants or walk slowly around the block if the weather is mild. Neighbors wave politely, but without curiosity, as though I am a fixture like the mailbox or the hedge, not a man with stories or pain. In the afternoons, I sometimes watch the television with the sound low, just to keep from feeling like the house is suffocating me. But even that feels like pretending to live rather than living. My evenings end early, not because I am tired, but because stretching the hours of wakefulness feels unbearable when there is no one to share them with. I climb into bed before 9, stare at the ceiling, and whisper good night to Margaret, though I know she has been gone almost a decade. It might sound as though I have surrendered to loneliness, but what keeps me restless, what gnaws at me with the persistence of a hidden infection, is not the absence of people, but the absence of dignity. When Margaret died, I told myself that at least I still had family, that Claire and her husband and my grandchildren would give me purpose. For a while, I clung to that belief, even when the invitations grew fewer, even when phone calls turned into hurried texts, even when I was asked for money with a smile that did not quite reach the eyes. I convinced myself that this was just how modern life was, that young people were busy, that they loved me even if they did not show it in the ways I expected. But as the years stretched on, I began to see the truth more clearly. I am no longer a central figure in their lives. I am a tolerated relic. They keep me on the sidelines, bringing me in only when it suits them, when they need to display a dutiful daughter, or when the grandchildren require tuition money. There are long months when my phone does not ring, and when it does, it is often Claire asking for something rather than offering companionship. I am aware of it, painfully so. Yet I continue to hope for scraps of kindness, because hope is a disease that never leaves a father, no matter how neglected he becomes. And so, when the story I'm about to tell began, when I received an invitation that seemed ordinary to anyone else but to me was extraordinary, I was almost foolishly grateful. The invitation was not to a holiday or to help with chores, but to something symbolic, a family dinner in honor of my grandson's birthday. It should have been nothing remarkable, yet for me it was like being handed a ticket back into the fold, a reminder that perhaps I still belonged. At the time, before the humiliation, before the revelation, I allowed myself to imagine that the evening would be warm and joyous, that I would sit among them as though nothing had changed, as though the years of distance and coldness were just, misunderstanding. That illusion was what sustained me as I pressed my best shirt, polished shoes that rarely left the closet, and wrapped a gift for the boy who hardly remembered to call me grandfather anymore. I believed, with a desperation that now seems naive, that the dinner would be the night I stepped back into my rightful place in the family circle. I was wrong. The day of the dinner began with an unusual restlessness, the kind that makes a man move from room to room without purpose, checking drawers, straightening pictures on the wall, brushing dust from furniture that no one would notice, all because he feels that something important is approaching, something that demands he look his best and prepare as though he still has a role to play. I woke before dawn and could not fall back asleep, my mind circling the thought that I'd been invited, that there was finally a seat waiting for me at a table that had not been mine for too many years. I told myself not to read too much into it, that it was just a birthday dinner for a teenager who probably preferred to be with his friends than with his grandfather. But deep inside, I clung to the possibility that this evening would be different, that it would not just be about the boy blowing out candles, but about me being reminded that I belonged, that I was still part of the foundation of the family. I shaved carefully, even though my hands trembled slightly when the razor moved across my cheek, and I pressed the shirt I had been saving for months without wearing, a pale blue cotton with a collar that no longer sat straight, but which to me represented dignity. I polished my shoes until I could see my face reflected in them, though the face was lined and tired and bore the unmistakable shadow of years spent in silence. Then I wrapped the gift, a book I had chosen with care, not some gadget or envelope of cash, but a book about history that I thought my grandson might, just might, grow into appreciating one day. As I tied the ribbon, I felt a sense of anticipation that was almost childlike, the kind I had not felt since Margaret and I used to host Christmas Eve dinners when the house was filled with noise and the oven steamed up the windows. When Claire called the night before, her tone had been brisk as it always was, but I caught something softer beneath it, or at least I convinced myself I did. "Dad," she said, "we're doing a dinner for Michael's birthday on Saturday. You should come." The words were clipped, hurried, but they contained a "you should come," which to me sounded like an invitation to return from exile. I asked what time I should arrive and what I should bring, and she answered that dinner was at 6 and that I did not need to bring anything, though the way she said it carried the faint suggestion that whatever I chose to bring would likely not be welcomed. Still, I told her I had something for Michael, and she sighed and said, "Fine. Just don't make it too old-fashioned." That stung more than I admitted, but I swallowed it because even that sigh meant contact, and contact was rare enough for me to take it with gratitude. The afternoon passed in a haze of preparation. I paced, checked the clock too often, reheated coffee I did not really want. Around 5:30 I locked the house and carried the gift carefully under my arm, like something fragile that could break at any moment. Their home was larger than mine, newer, with a driveway that seemed always to be occupied by cars that I suspected cost more than I made in a year during my teaching days. I had helped them with money when they bought it, though no plaque bore my name. No one remembered my contribution. When I walked up the path and rang the bell, I heard laughter inside, voices overlapping, music playing softly, and for a moment my heart lifted, imagining I was about to step into a warm room where I would be welcomed with smiles. Claire opened the door. She was dressed beautifully in a way that reminded me how far she had traveled. From the girl who used to sit on the porch in torn jeans, reading library books by the armful, she gave me a quick hug that smelled faintly of perfume and impatience, and behind her I could see the bustle of the dining room. "Dad, good, you're here," she said, but not with joy, more like relief that I had followed instructions. She took the package from me without looking at it and placed it on a side table with other brightly wrapped boxes that I guessed were filled with electronics or clothes, things that glittered more than my carefully chosen book. "Come in," she said, and I stepped inside, breathing in the scent of a roast meat and garlic, a smell that transported me for an instant back to Margaret's kitchen, though here it felt sharper, less forgiving. The dining table stretched across the room, already set with plates and glasses that caught the light. Around it sat guests, neighbors, colleagues of my son-in-law, children I barely recognized because they had grown so tall and strange in my absence. They were talking loudly, passing bread baskets, raising glasses, and not one person paused to acknowledge me as I entered. I waited for Claire to lead me to a seat, but she was already turning away to refill someone's wine glass. My son-in-law, Mark, noticed me then, his tall frame blocking part of the table as he leaned on the back of a chair. "Ed," he said, using my name instead of Dad or even Mr. Mallory. "Glad you made it. Find yourself a spot." His voice carried that casual authority of a man who owns the room, and it was only when I glanced at the chairs that I realized every one of them was occupied. Children sprawled across two. Adults leaned comfortably back in others. Even a neighbor I did not know sat laughing with a fork in hand. But nowhere, not a single place, had been left for me. For a moment I thought there must be some mistake, that perhaps another chair was tucked in the corner, or that someone would quickly rise and say, Here, this is for you." I scanned the room, my eyes moving desperately from one seat to another, but nothing changed. And then Mark grinned and said loudly enough for the others to hear, "Don't worry, Ed. Standing is good for the circulation. Keeps the blood flowing." Laughter rippled across the table. Not cruel, not sharp, but the careless laughter of people amused by a joke at someone else's expense. My face grew hot, and I looked toward Claire, hoping she would object, that she would tell her husband not to speak that way. Instead, she smiled weakly and said, "We'll find something for you, Dad. Just wait a bit." And then she turned back to her conversation as though nothing had happened. I stood there, clutching the back of a chair that belonged to someone else, the noise of the room swelling around me like a tide. My grandson, the one whose birthday it was, looked at me briefly and then away, embarrassed perhaps, or simply uninterested. My gift sat unopened on the side table, already forgotten beneath brighter wrapping. I felt my knees ache from standing, but more than that, I felt the weight of invisibility pressing down on me, the knowledge that I had not even been granted the dignity of a seat at my own grandson's birthday dinner. The room blurred slightly, not from drink, because I had not been offered any, but from the sudden rush of humiliation that made me dizzy. This, I realized, was not an accident. It was not a matter of oversight or busyness. It was a symbol, intentional or not, of where I stood in their lives. Unnecessary, peripheral, tolerated, but not respected. I tried to steady myself, to remind myself that it was only a chair, that perhaps someone would bring one from the kitchen in a moment, that I should not read too much into the oversight. But the laughter from Mark's joke still rang in my ears, and Claire's faint smile still burned in my mind. And I knew, with the clarity of a man who has spent too many hours alone with his thoughts, that this was the beginning of something darker. What I did not know yet was how that darkness would turn, how humiliation would transform into defiance, and how a forgotten old man would soon decide that if they would not give him a chair, he would claim a throne instead. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for a gesture, waiting for the simple courtesy that even strangers extend to one another when a seat is lacking. But no one moved, and no chair was fetched. And gradually, I realized that my presence was not an oversight, but an inconvenience, an afterthought wedged into an evening that had been carefully arranged without me in mind. The table gleamed under the chandelier, silverware neatly aligned, plates filled and refilled as dishes were passed from hand to hand. But I remained on the edge like an intruder at a feast, the kind of man who lingers at the threshold hoping for scraps. Claire glanced at me once, just long enough to register that I was still standing, then looked away as though my discomfort embarrassed her, as though acknowledging me would expose some flaw in her perfect evening. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually across the back of his seat, and smirked in a way that made me feel as if this entire oversight were deliberate. A small power he could exercise with impunity because he knew no one would challenge him. I told myself I would not let it matter, that I had endured worse, that perhaps in a few minutes someone would clear a space. But the laughter around me grew louder, the clinking of glasses sharper, and I realized that every passing moment deepened. The insult. My grandson Michael, the boy whose birthday this was, sat at the far end of the table with his friends, all of them taller and broader than the child I remembered, their voices cracking into adulthood, their faces already hardened with the carelessness of youth. He did not rise to greet me or ask if I had a seat. He simply nodded faintly when our eyes met, and then turned back to his peers, laughing at something on a phone screen. I cannot say I blamed him entirely, for children are reflections of the world they are raised in, and if the adults around him treated me as unnecessary, why would he think otherwise? Still, a sharp pang struck me, because once upon a time he had sat on my lap, asking me to tell him stories about knights and kings, and I had believed that bond would outlast neglect. Now he looked through me as though I were nothing more than a shadow cast against the wall. After a while, Claire came to my side and touched my arm lightly, the way one might touch a stranger to excuse oneself in a crowded place. "Dad," she said, her voice pitched low, as though she did not want the others to hear, "there's a stool in the kitchen. We'll bring it out in a minute. Just be patient." She said it with the smile of someone appeasing a difficult child, not with the concern of a daughter addressing her father. I nodded stiffly, unwilling to protest, though inside something coiled tight, a mixture of anger and shame that burned hotter the longer I stood. She disappeared again, and I heard her laughing moments later at some joke Mark had made, and the promise of the stool never materialized. Instead, time stretched on, each minute of standing another reminder of where I ranked, another reminder that I had no place among them. At one point, a neighbor I had never met, a woman with too much jewelry clinking on her wrists, turned to me and said, "Oh dear, you don't have a seat. That's such a shame." And then she turned back to her plate without moving an inch to offer hers. Her words were not compassion, but pity, and pity is sometimes crueler than open disdain. I smiled weakly, though it felt like a grimace, and muttered something about being fine, but inside I was far from fine. My legs ached, my back tightened, and the humiliation gnawed at me with relentless persistence. I thought of Margaret then, how she would have bristled at such treatment, how she would have scolded Claire for forgetting the most basic respect. And I wished with an almost unbearable longing that she were alive to see what her daughter had become. The meal continued without me, or rather around me, as though I were invisible. Plates of roast beef, bowls of potatoes, and baskets of bread passed from hand to hand, and not once did anyone think to include me. I reached for a bread roll at one point, but the basket was taken away just as my fingers touched the edge, and I withdrew my hand as though burned. Mark noticed and smirked again, lifting his glass to me in a mock salute before drinking deeply. My throat was dry, but no one offered water, and I realized that even if a glass were placed in front of me, I would not be given the dignity of sitting to drink it. I leaned against the wall, pretending it was by choice, though every muscle in my body screamed with fatigue. What made the situation unbearable was not only the absence of a chair, but the performance of it, the way it became part of the evening's rhythm, a running joke that only I did not laugh at. At one point someone asked Mark if he wanted more wine, and he said, "Sure, and maybe get some for Ed too. Oh wait, he doesn't need it. He's got to stay on his feet to keep from falling asleep." Laughter followed, including Claire's thin laugh, the one she used when she wanted to seem agreeable, and I felt my face flush hot with shame. My hands trembled, not from age this time, but from the effort of holding back words I wanted to hurl across the table, words that would have shattered the illusion of civility, but would also have branded me the bitter old man they already half believed me to be. Then came the moment that broke something inside me. A young guest, one of Michael's friends, perhaps 15 or 16, looked up at me and said, "Doesn't your grandpa need to sit down?" His tone was not kind, but mocking, a teenager emboldened by the laughter of adults. Michael snickered, adding, "He's fine. He doesn't eat much anyway. Grandpa's on a permanent diet." The table erupted again, and I realized with a jolt that even the children had learned to see me as a caricature, as an easy target. I wanted to shout, to remind them that I had once been a man who commanded respect, that I had shaped young minds, that I had provided for this family long before they were born. Instead, I stood silent, a monument of humiliation, and something hardened in me, a resolve that had been dormant for years, but now stirred awake. I scanned the room then, not for a chair, but for something larger, something symbolic, That was when my eyes landed on the massive leather armchair at the head of the table, the one Mark always claimed as his, the one he leaned back in like a king surveying his court. It was not just furniture, it was a throne, the emblem of his authority in the household, and I remembered with painful clarity that it had once been mine. That very chair had sat in my own living room years ago before I gave it to them when they moved into this house, telling myself that I no longer needed it, that it was better suited to a younger man's home. Seeing it there, claimed by the very person who now left me standing, struck me with the force of revelation. The chair was not just wood and leather. It was the symbol of everything I had surrendered, everything that had been taken from me under the guise of generosity. I knew then that the evening would not end as they expected. They thought they could leave me standing, thought they could turn me into an exhibit of decline, but I would not allow it. If they would not give me a place, I would take one, and not just any place, but the very seat they guarded as a throne. Something inside me shifted from humiliation to defiance, from silence to a resolve as cold and sharp as steel. I did not act immediately, for I wanted them comfortable in their disdain, but in my mind I already saw it clearly. I would sit where they least expected, and in doing so I would remind them, if only for a moment, that I was not a man to be erased. The longer I stood there, the more I felt myself splitting in two, as if one part of me was the weary old man they wanted me to be, the figure in the corner who could be ignored or mocked without consequence, while the other part was the man I used to be, the man who had commanded classrooms, who had sat at the head of this very family with a firm voice and a steady hand, who had once been listened to with respect, if not with love. For too long I had allowed the first version to dominate, shrinking myself to fit the role they had written for me, grateful for scraps of attention, tolerating insults that I told myself were misunderstandings. But on that evening, something inside me rebelled, something old and stubborn and still alive. I could not continue standing there like a servant waiting to be told what to do. My knees ached, my back throbbed, but more than physical pain, it was the pain of invisibility. The knowledge that my own daughter and grandchildren did not think me worthy of a simple chair. That realization was the spark that turned humiliation into resolve. As the main course was served, plates heavy with meat and vegetables, laughter rolling from one end of the table to the other, I straightened myself and let my eyes travel again to the armchair at the head. It sat there solid and immovable, upholstered in dark leather that gleamed under the lights, its high back almost regal in design. A chair made not for sitting casually, but for presiding, for ruling, for being seen. I remembered the day I bought it decades earlier, how Margaret had teased me for choosing something so imposing, how Claire as a child had climbed into it, with a book, curling up against the armrest, while I pretended to scold her for wrinkling the leather. That chair carried the memory of my home, of my authority, of my role as head of the family, and seeing Mark lounged in it with his smirk had always felt like a theft. But now, in this moment, I saw it as a chance for reclamation. If I could not be granted a seat at their table, then I would take the seat that mattered most. I moved before I could talk myself out of it, slowly but steadily, as though my steps were carried by something greater than my own will. The room did not notice at first. They were too busy eating, too busy laughing at Mark's endless anecdotes, too absorbed in their small world that excluded me. But when I reached the head of the table and placed my hand on the back of the chair, the noise softened, then stilled. Mark looked up, his fork midway to his mouth, confusion spreading across his face. Claire turned sharply, her eyes widening in disbelief, as though I had committed some grave breach of etiquette. For a moment no one spoke, the silence heavy and expectant, and I realized the balance of the evening had shifted. Without a word, I pulled the chair back and lowered myself into it, the leather groaning slightly under my weight, a sound that felt almost like welcome, like an old friend remembering me. I straightened my back, placed my hands on the armrests, and looked out at the table, at the faces staring at me with varying degrees of shock, irritation, and amusement. For the first time that evening, I was not standing on the margins. I was at the center, in the throne that symbolized authority, and though I knew it was a small act, in that moment it felt like defiance, like justice. Mark laughed then, a short, incredulous laugh that carried no humor. "Well, would you look at that," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The king has returned." A few others chuckled nervously, unsure whether to treat it as a joke or a provocation. Claire leaned forward, her voice sharp with embarrassment. "Dad, please, that's Mark's chair. Don't make a scene." Her words struck me harder than she knew, because what she called a scene was in fact the first real claim of dignity I had made in years. I could have stood then, apologized, shuffled back to the wall like the obedient figure they wanted me to be. But something in me had snapped, and once broken, it could not be mended. I cleared my throat, the sound loud in the silence, and when I spoke, my voice carried more strength than I expected. "For years," I said, "I've been standing at the edge of your lives, standing outside of your conversations, standing in the shadows of a family I helped build. Tonight, when I came here, I thought perhaps I would sit again at your table, but instead I was left with nothing, not even a chair." My words echoed in the stillness, and though my voice shook slightly with age, it did not falter with fear. I looked at Claire then, at the daughter who had once clung to my hand on her first day of school, and I saw her mouth open to protest, but I continued before she could speak. "If you will not give me a place, I will take one, and I will take the place that was once mine, the place I surrendered too easily. You call this Mark's chair, but it was mine before it was his, and tonight it is mine again." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the clink of a fork being set down too loudly. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his friends whispering to one another, their youthful arrogance momentarily silenced. Mark leaned back, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed, as though he were deciding whether to laugh again or to explode. Claire flushed red, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted her wine glass but did not drink. Around the table, I saw faces of neighbors and colleagues, all suddenly aware that the evening had turned into something larger, something charged, something that would be remembered. For me, it was not merely a rebellion against being left without a chair. It was a declaration that I would not be erased. In that moment, as I sat in the leather armchair with all eyes upon me, I felt something close to power. Not the kind of power I once held in classrooms or even in my own home, but the power of reclaiming dignity in the face of humiliation. I knew the consequences would follow, that Claire would scold me, that Mark would mock me, that whispers would circulate after the dinner. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that for one brief moment I sat not as an afterthought, but as a man, a father, a presence that could not be ignored. And as I sat there, watching their discomfort grow, I realized that this was the turning point, the moment from which there could be no return to silence, whether they chose to resent me or fear me or dismiss me further. I had broken the spell of invisibility. They had tried to deny me a chair, but I had claimed a throne, and in doing so I had changed the terms of everything that would follow. The silence that followed my words was not the silence of respect, but of unease, the kind of heavy pause that falls when something has broken through the surface of polite pretenses and revealed what everyone was trying not to see. I sat in that armchair, the leather warm under me, the weight of its history pressing into my bones, and though my heart beat faster than it had in years. Mark's laugh, when it finally came, was louder than before, forced, meant to cover the shift in atmosphere. He slapped his palm on the table as though to reclaim control, saying, "Well, isn't this something? Ed has decided he's king for the night." His voice mocking, his grin too wide, but I could see in his eyes that he was not as amused as he pretended. A man like Mark does not enjoy being challenged, least of all in his own house, in front of his colleagues and friends. And the fact that I had dared to sit in his chair struck him not only as insolence, but as an open act of rebellion. Claire leaned forward, her face taut, her voice low but sharp. "Dad, please, don't do this now. You're embarrassing yourself. Just let Mark sit down, and we'll bring you another chair." She said it quickly, urgently, as if trying to patch a tear in fabric before it unraveled completely. But the more she spoke, the more I realized how deeply she was invested in appearances. It wasn't my dignity that concerned her. It was hers. The fear of how it would look to the others that her father was disrupting the flawless surface of her life. I saw her glance toward the guests, offering them a smile that begged them to dismiss my behavior as senility or eccentricity. And that glance pierced me deeper than any insult. She was willing to sacrifice me to save her own face, to make me the fool rather than admit that the insult had begun with them, with their failure to treat me as family. One of Mark's colleagues, a man with thinning hair and a tie, loosened around his neck, chuckled nervously and said, "Well, every king needs a throne, I suppose," trying to ease the tension. But his eyes darted between Mark and me, measuring the balance of power. Michael and his friends whispered, their heads bent together, smirks tugging at their mouths as though my act of defiance were nothing more than comic theater. My grandson, whose birthday this was, did not defend me or even look at me with curiosity. He simply shook his head and muttered something that made the boys beside him laugh harder. It was then I realized that the younger generation had not inherited even a trace of respect for me, that whatever bond once existed had been carefully eroded by the stories Claire and Mark had told, by the image of me they had constructed in my absence, an image of frailty, of irrelevance, of someone to be tolerated but not admired. I should have risen then, perhaps, walked away with dignity. But my anger grew roots, and I felt them digging deeper with every heartbeat. For years I had endured their dismissals in silence, telling myself that love meant forgiveness, that family bonds could survive neglect. But sitting there, watching their faces twist in discomfort, I understood that love without respect is hollow. That bonds built only on duty rot from within. So instead of yielding, I spoke again, my voice steadier now, fueled by the fire of long-buried truth. "Embarrassing myself?" I repeated slowly, savoring the words. "No, Claire, I embarrassed myself when I kept quiet all these years, when I let you treat me like a relic, when I accepted scraps of attention and pretended it was love. Tonight, I am not embarrassed. Tonight, I remember who I am." The room shifted uneasily. Mark set down his fork with a deliberate clang and leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes narrowing. "You want to remember who you are, Ed? Then remember this. You're a guest in my house, my table, my rules. And in my house, that chair's mine." His voice was calm but edged with steel, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. He expected me to back down, to apologize, to slink away in defeat, but something in me snapped then, something that had been stretched too far for too long, and I looked him straight in the eye with a steadiness that surprised even me. "Your house?" I said. "Tell me, Mark, whose money helped you buy it? Whose years of savings went into this place you call yours? And yet not once have you invited me to sit at your table as though I belong. You take my money, my labor, my years, but you cannot give me a chair?" Gasps sounded around the table, small but sharp, as though I had said something indecent. Claire's face turned crimson, and she hissed, "Dad, stop it! This isn't the time." But I ignored her, my words gathering momentum like a storm. "I built this family. I worked for decades so that you could have a life, so that you could stand on the foundation I laid. And now you repay me by leaving me standing like a beggar in the corner of my own bloodline's celebration. Tell me, is that respect? Is that love? Or is it simply convenience, the same convenience that makes you call me only when you need something?" The silence afterward was suffocating. I saw truth flicker across some faces, guilt across others, but pride and anger hardened Mark's expression. He leaned back slowly, his smile returning, though it was thin and cold. "If you wanted gratitude, Ed, you should have asked for it. You gave because you wanted to, and now you're bitter because no one built a monument to your generosity. That's not on us. That's on you." His words landed like blows, calculated to make me doubt myself, but they did not break me. Instead, they clarified everything I had been unwilling to admit. This man did not see me as father or elder or even as a human being deserving of basic courtesy. He saw me as a resource, one that had been useful once but was now depleted, and the only power left to him was mockery. Claire tried again to intervene, her voice trembling now. "Please, Dad, just get up. Let's not ruin Michael's night. We'll talk about this later." But there was no later. I knew it in my bones. This was the moment, the line from which there was no retreat. Rising then would not mend the evening. It would simply confirm their vision of me as pliable, as weak, as someone who could be pushed aside indefinitely. So I stayed seated, my hands firm on the armrests, my eyes locked on Mark's, and I said, "No, I will not get up. Not tonight, not again. If you wanted me silent and invisible, you should never have invited me here." Around the table murmurs grew, neighbors shifting uncomfortably, colleagues exchanging glances. The weight of the confrontation pressed down on everyone, and though some looked away in embarrassment, I knew they understood what was happening. An old man reclaiming dignity in a house where it had been denied. But even as I sat firm, I saw the walls closing in, the lines of battle drawn. Mark would not forget this humiliation. Claire would not forgive the exposure. And my grandchildren, raised on their parents' disdain, would not suddenly find respect. I had lit a fire that could not be extinguished, and its smoke was already choking the room. In that moment, though, I did not care. For the first time in years, I felt alive, not as a shadow, but as a man who still had voice and will. They had tried to deny me a chair, and I had taken their throne, and in doing so, I had forced them to see me, if only in anger. That recognition, bitter as it was, mattered more than all the empty invitations, more than all the polite neglect. It was the beginning of something inevitable, the escalation that would strip away every pretense and reveal what my family truly thought of me, and what I would finally decide to do in return. I do not know how long I sat there, the weight of the chair beneath me and the weight of all their stares pressing from above. But it felt like an eternity contained within a few heartbeats, the kind of moment when a man realizes there is no turning back, that whatever words he chooses will burn the bridges behind him and set the course of what little future he has left. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, the trembling not from weakness, but from the flood of something I had almost forgotten existed. Righteous anger, a fire that once had carried me through classrooms of unruly children and through the long years of providing for a family that did not thank me but depended on me all the same. Sitting in that chair, in that so-called throne, I felt Margaret at my back, not in voice, but in memory, the reminder that I had once been more than an inconvenience, that I had once been the pillar of a home. Mark tried to laugh again, though it was thinner now, stretched too tight, and I saw the tension in his jaw, the fury in his eyes that he was trying to mask with a grin. "So, what then, Ed?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You want to give a speech? Go on, then. Tell us what the great patriarch has to say." He leaned back as though offering me the stage, certain that whatever I said would collapse under its own weight, certain that the others would laugh with him and not with me. Claire pressed her hand to her forehead, shaking her head slowly, muttering, "Please, Dad, not now." But her words were no longer enough to hold me back. I placed both hands on the arms of the chair and leaned forward slightly, letting my eyes travel around the table, forcing each of them to meet my gaze. "All my life," I began, my voice steady but heavy with years, "I have worked for the sake of this family. I gave my youth to the classroom so that children, other people's children, might learn to respect history, to respect where they came from. I came home tired, but I gave what I had left to you, Claire, and to your mother. I saved every penny I could. I sacrificed every luxury, so that you would never want for food, for books, for a future. I built a house that sheltered you. I carried burdens you never saw. And when the time came, when you asked, I gave again. I gave to help you buy this house, this place you now call yours. And what do I have in return?" I paused, letting the silence stretch, the clinking of forks stilled, the shifting of bodies betraying their unease. "I have no seat at your table. I have no voice in your lives. I am invited when it suits you, ignored when it does not, and laughed at as though I were already half gone." My words cut deeper than I expected. One of the neighbors lowered her eyes, uncomfortable. Another cleared his throat as though he wished to excuse himself. Michael looked away, embarrassed now not by me, but by the nakedness of truth. Though whether it reached his heart I could not tell. Claire's eyes glistened with tears, but I knew they were not for me. They were for herself, for the embarrassment of a father breaking the script of civility. Mark, though, remained fixed, his smirk returning with the stubbornness of pride. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said, his voice low and cold. "No one owes you anything. You chose to give, and now you want to be repaid with worship. That's not how the world works, Ed. This isn't your kingdom. It's mine." I felt a strange calm settle over me then, as though I had been waiting for those very words. I leaned back in the chair, my fingers tightening on the leather. "You think it's your kingdom because you sit at the head of the table, because people laugh at your jokes, because they nod when you speak. But let me remind you, Mark, this house would not stand without the money I gave, money I earned with years of sweat and sacrifice. Every brick here has a piece of me in it, and yet you deny me even a chair. So if this is your kingdom, it was built on my back, and tonight I take back my place, if only for one meal, if only for one moment." The words hung there, and for the first time, Mark did not laugh. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his face darkening with anger. "Get out," he said, his voice sharp, brittle. "Get out of my house." His command rang through the room, but I did not move. Instead, I let the silence stretch, then answered quietly, "No, not until I finish saying what needs to be said." I turned my gaze to Claire then, and my voice softened, though the steel remained. "Daughter, I raised you better than this. I raised you to honor what came before, to respect the hands that built your foundation. but you have forgotten. You have let comfort and appearances mean more to you than love. I have been patient. I have been forgiving. But patience without recognition becomes weakness, and I will not be weak any more. Claire's lips trembled, her eyes darting toward the guests, the neighbors, the colleagues, as though their judgment mattered more than mine, as though she would rather protect her image than confront the truth of what I had said. And I realized then that I was speaking not only to her, not only to Mark, not only to the children, but to every person at that table, to every witness who had seen me stand in silence and thought it acceptable. I raised my voice slightly, letting it carry across the room. One day, each of you will be where I am now, old, tired, wondering if the people you loved will remember who you are, or if they will tuck you into a corner like furniture too inconvenient to throw away. And when that day comes, perhaps you will remember this night, and you will understand what it means to be denied dignity. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Mark did not speak. I could see him struggling, torn between rage and the awareness that I had taken the room from him, if only for a moment. Claire sat frozen, her face pale, her hands trembling. The neighbors looked down, uncomfortable, while Michael stared at his plate, no longer smirking, no longer whispering. For the first time that evening, I was not invisible. For the first time in years, they heard me. I pushed back from the table then, rising slowly, my body heavy with age, but my spirit lighter than it had been in a long time. You wanted me to stand, I said, my voice quieter now, almost weary. Very well. I have stood all my life, but tonight I sat, and I will not forget that. I let the words linger, then stepped away from the chair, leaving it behind but carrying with me the knowledge that I had claimed it, that I had reminded them and myself of who I was. I walked toward the door, the room still silent, no one daring to stop me, no one daring to follow. When I reached the threshold, I turned once more, looking at Claire, at Mark, at the faces that had once meant home and now meant betrayal. Enjoy your dinner, I said softly. It may be the last meal we share. Then I left, closing the door behind me, the cool night air rushing against my face, carrying with it the strange, fierce relief of a man who has finally spoken his truth, no matter the cost. When I stepped out into the night air, leaving behind the muffled silence of the dining room and the stunned faces of those who had once called themselves my family, I felt a chill that was not just from the wind, but from the finality of what had just happened. I knew, as I walked slowly down the path toward the street, that something had ended inside that house, something that could not be stitched back together with apologies or false pleasantries. For years I had been clinging to the idea of family as though it were a lifeline, convincing myself that love could survive neglect, that blood could excuse betrayal. But the truth had been laid bare. I had become nothing more than a burden to them, a figure they tolerated at best and mocked at worst. And my silence had given them permission to treat me that way. That silence ended tonight. The streets were quiet as I walked home, the houses glowing with warm lights in their windows. Other families gathered around tables, where perhaps fathers were honored, where grandfathers were listened to, or perhaps not. Perhaps many of those lights hid scenes just like mine, where age was an inconvenience and dignity was something stripped away in small humiliations. I did not know, and I did not care. All I knew was that I had walked out of my daughter's home, not as a man defeated, but as a man who had finally drawn a line, a man who had chosen dignity over pretense. It was not triumph I felt, but clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when you have nothing left to lose. When I reached my house, I unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar silence. The walls greeting me with their emptiness, the air carrying the faint must of age. And for the first time, I did not feel the silence as a punishment, but as a refuge. This was my home, my space, the place where Margaret's memory still lived, where every creak of the floorboard reminded me of a life once shared with someone who never questioned my worth. I hung my coat, placed my shoes neatly by the door, and sat down in my old armchair, the one I had kept for myself when I gave away the others, the one that had carried me through long evenings of solitude. As I lowered myself into it, I realized that this was my throne, not the leather chair in Mark's dining room, not the seat at a table that had no place for me, but this simple worn chair that had held me through grief and loneliness, the chair where I still had the power to decide who I was. The next morning, I called a lawyer, a man I had not spoken to in years, and told him I wanted to make changes to my will. My voice did not tremble as I explained that my daughter and her husband would no longer be beneficiaries, that my estate would go elsewhere, to a scholarship fund for students of history perhaps, or to a charity that would not forget me once the check was written. The lawyer asked if I was sure, and I told him I had never been more certain. Blood may bind, but respect sustains. And without respect, blood is only a stain that lingers long after its meaning has drained away. Days passed, then weeks, and the phone did not ring. There were no visits, no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. Perhaps Claire simmered with anger. Perhaps Mark laughed it off with his friends. Perhaps Michael told the story of his crazy grandfather to his peers. I did not know and did not need to know. Their silence was only the confirmation of what I had already accepted, that I had lost nothing by leaving that house, because what they had given me in recent years was not love, but humiliation dressed as family obligation. Better the clean break of truth than the slow poison of pretense. In the evenings now, I sit in my chair and I feel something strange, something I had not felt in a long time. Peace. It is not the peace of reconciliation or of being surrounded by family, but the peace of having faced humiliation and refused to bow to it. The peace of knowing that I spoke when it mattered, that I claimed my dignity even if it cost me the last. Scraps of connection. Sometimes I imagine Margaret beside me, her hand on mine, her voice saying, "At last, Ed, you remembered who you are. And though it is only memory, it is enough." They refused to give me a chair at their table, and I walked away. But in walking away, I found my own throne again, not in their house, but in my own heart. And though I may spend the rest of my days alone, I will spend them with dignity and tact, which is more than they ever offered me.